Thank you. So yes, my name is Richard Thomas. I'm a data manager at the UK LLC, and I'm going to talk about the working in the TRE and the data that we have in there. And just to say before we move on, at the moment we're obviously open for applications, but we also have 6 research projects which are active in the trusted research environment at the moment. So there's about 12 users who are already in the TRE and using the data and giving us really good feedback. So we're always looking to improve the system. So in this presentation, I'm just talk about what data is available, look at upcoming data, just talk about what the trusted research environment is. We use the SERP, and about controls around the SERP and getting files in and out of the system. So as Robin flashed up earlier, here's the LPSs which have contributed to the UK LLC. So we have data from these studies within the trusted research environment, and we're approaching now about 250,000 participants with data, most of which are linked to the NHS Digital flow as well. So in terms of the linked data from NHS Digital, we've got data, GP data, vaccination data, COVID testing data, pillars 1 to 3, HES, which is hospital episode statistics data, CHESS, which is a hospitalization specific to COVID, cancer mortality registry data, mental health data, and some prescribing data as well. So just to go into a little bit of detail about the COVID specific data sets, we have a GP extract, which is specific for pandemic planning and research, which has codes which NHS Digital have deemed pertinent to COVID, as well as vaccination data about people's vaccination status, so which vaccine they've had, CVAR, which is whether they've had any adverse reactions to their vaccination, and then we have several testing data sets which cover pillars 1 to 3. So we've got SGSS, which is a mostly hospital focused testing data set, and then NPEX, which is a much bigger pillar 2 community testing data set, and then IELISA, which is a antibody testing, which is part of pillar 3, and then we've got the CHESS, as mentioned earlier, which is a specific hospitalization data set for people who've been quite poorly with COVID, and there's with a few of our current researchers in the system, they are looking at deriving a COVID status output, which will then be made available and reusable within the system, and the definition of that will be reusable and available in the system, so that one doesn't have to go through and reinvent the wheel and traipse through these data if one was just interested in a sort of derived COVID status sort of outputs. Okay, so just shifting data sets slightly. That's what I've talked about what we have currently. I'm just going to give a quick overview of some of the data that we've got upcoming. So we are working with the University of Leicester, who are doing some modelling on built environment type variables, so air quality, noise, greenness, and green space. So in terms of air quality, we're looking at NO2, PM 2.5, and others, and these will have national coverage, and these will be annual averages from for about the last 12 years or so. And we're also looking at doing, or they're working on noise models at the moment, which will also be available in the next couple of months, and greenness and green space. So this will be available on studies who've allowed address data to flow. So some studies have allowed it to flow, some haven't. So if they have, then we can tie these exposures to their postcode and their property level and then that will be available. So we don't currently have this yet. This is a work in progress, but we're hoping in the next couple of months this will be available in the UKLLC as well. Okay, so I've talked about data so far. Now I'm going to talk about the system in which the data is stored. So we use something called UKSERP, which is a trusted research environment. It's hosted at Swansea University, and the UKLLC have an instance of this. So just in terms of what it looks like, it's a Windows 10 environment, and it has the standard software packages which one might work with. So SQL Server Management Studio, Python, R, Stata, SPSS. So it's quite once you log into the system, it's quite a familiar environment. It's just like working with a remote desktop. We pre-installed these software packages. And if you want anything above and beyond this is also possible, providing that it's either open source or that a license key can be provided. And so the system has controls on data in and out of the system. So the UKLLC control all the data which go into the system, and research users can't pull data out of the system, but what you can do is request your publication ready outputs from the system. So once you've created graphs or tables or whatever the output may be, you can go through a file out process where it goes for, if it's a table or graph or a model output, it will go for a statistical disclosure review by a specialist team at Swansea. You can push data into the system. Sorry, you can't push data into the system. You can push files into the system. If you want to push in syntax, which you've perhaps written outside the system, or documentation, which is pertinent to your research question, you can push those into the system, and this goes through a light touch review and will be available in the system if you need to bring those in. And yes, internet connections are locked down, so there's only specific internet connections which are available. Things like downloading R packages and Python packages, those things are whitelisted, so you can work fairly freely with those packages without running into trouble. But you can't access the internet within the system. Okay, so logging into the system, you will be issued with a username and a YubiKey, which is a little USB that you put into your computer, which enables a two-factor authentication. You'll be able to set your password and log in once you've downloaded VMware Horizon Client, which is a application which allows the connection to the desktop. So once you arrive in the SERP, in the TRE, there is documentation available about where to find your data and about the stats packages available and where to find them. So there's a user guide on that. There's also a video walkthrough for your first time login to help you get set up for the first time. There's also syntax available, which can help set up your Python environment. And there's also helper syntax for Python, R, and Stata is also being developed at the moment. So what this does is connects the user to the database. It pulls all the views that you've been approved to use, and it adds any variable or value labeling where appropriate for those data sets. There's also a Jupyter Notebook helper available, and yes, the R helper is now available, and the Stata one will be available very shortly. Okay, so you'll have a project area, which is essentially a folder which is named after your project number, and you'll have read-write permissions to work in this folder, and all your working should be kept in this folder. There will be a handful of standard folders which will be available in that folder, and they will contain things like the views which are available at each time point, and any documentation which is relevant. And you, once you're set up in the system, you can use this folder and create subfolders as you like. So in terms of navigating the data in the SERP, all the data is stored in a SQL database, and you'll be created a series of project-specific views for your data, and there will be a schema available, which all those data views will be tied to, and your permissions will be driven through that schema. So, and there's a standard naming convention so that you can identify what's what. So you have your project number as the schema, and then the view name is made up of the source of the data, so the LPS study or NHSD where applicable. Descriptive name of the data, so you know which data set that comes from, and then a version and a date. There's also metadata views available, and every user has access to metadata from every single data set which is available. So you can obviously tie any data to its corresponding metadata, but also you can explore the metadata about data that you don't have, if that's of interest, and possibly put an amendment if you wanted extra data. Yes, and I talked about helper syntax. So yeah, this will ease the loading of these data sets. So we have a Jupyter notebook available in the system. So this is one of our recommended ways of working. And if you were sort of first-time user of Jupyter notebook, we've sort of set up a getting started, if you see what I mean, notebook, which will pull your data and give you some basic stats about what you have. And the idea is that you can pick this up and perhaps carry on using Jupyter notebook if you wanted to. And the notebook has an underlying sort of Python helper class which has a series of functions which the notebook calls and uses. So this is supposed to sort of enable the initial overview of your data and enable you to explore it. Okay, so just one thing to say about data structure. So the cohort data, so the LPS data, typically those data sets are one row per person, as you can see on the left. The colors identify a distinct person here, and we minimize those tables by the table which that data sits in. The NHS data is predominantly many rows per person. It's event-based, it's long data, and it has timestamps. Therefore, you get several rows per person, and with an associated time date stamp. So person A has been to hospital 5 times for 5 different things. And this is minimized to the code lists. So as Sammy pointed out earlier, you have to define a series of code lists to get the associated rows that person has been to or had an interaction with a health service for. So that's just to make you aware that the sort of harmonization, how you bring these two distinct data structures together, would just need some thought, because for any of those of you who haven't worked with event-based or NHS digital data before, it's something to be aware of. So yeah, just building on the medical code list. So we minimize the NHS data sets to the code list, the code systems which are in those data sets. So what you can do here is there are standard code lists available from places like Calibre link I put up in there. So if you want to look at how other people have defined certain conditions within health data sets, you can go here and pick those up, or you can define your own if you're happy with that. So having said all that, we are also currently working on a bit of a new model for this, because this has been a bit of a stumbling block, and feedback we've had from users is that defining medical code lists, there's a few different systems used across all the data sets that we have, and actually defining them is quite time consuming and also quite tricky, and often can be it can be helpful to have a clinician to help you sort of define these and get these conditions right via these code lists. So because of that, we're working on a new model by which we make all the data available to allow exploration. When I say all the data, we will have to minimize it to remove particularly sensitive areas of health from that data. So we may have to remove things like sexual health and mental health, so that we've done a minimization on that data, and then allow those minimized data sets available to flow, so you can work with and look at the code list, which also look at the codes which are commonly used, because it's not always clear from just looking at a raw code list which codes are used in reality, and therefore that come through in the data. So we sort of acknowledge this is defining code is a tricky job, and that's why we're looking at this new model. So over the next few weeks, we're exploring this, and depending on the timing of your application, you may be able to not define a code list, if you see what I mean. Yep. Okay, and I think I touched on this earlier, but going back to files in and out of SERP, just to reiterate, files in, so documentation syntax can come in, no data. And in terms of files out, these are your publication sort of ready outputs, so tables, graphs, stats model outputs. And we basically follow the ONS safe researcher principles here, and we will provide a checklist so that you can have a look at what you're bringing out and just check it matches with the rules which are in place. Okay, thank you very much. That's the end of my presentation.